Hello and welcome to this session on choosing and administering organisational bias tests. So this session is designed for someone who might be considering doing some quite broad and wide-ranging organisational bias testing. So not just a team of senior leaders or a few HR managers. This is for people who are considering testing larger numbers and samples within their organisation. I'm Pete Jones from Sharp Professional Chartered Psychologist, so I'm the author of Bias Test, and a test you may have come across as a predecessor to Bias Test, which was called Implicitly, which was sold by Hogreffer, the European-wide test publisher. So this session then has really got three particular elements to it, and I'm going to try and make it literally as easy as 1, 2, 3 for you. So three simple steps then. So the first simple step is, how do we choose our tests and decide who we're going to give it to? The second one is, how do we administer those bias tests? And the third one is, how do we get the results back to find out what those results are telling us about our organisation? And I'll share with you, by the way, some results from an organisation where we did some quite extensive ethnicity bias testing, just to get you a feel for how you can use the results. So let's start off with choosing the test then. Very few organisations just go and choose a random test to test their staff with. There's usually some kind of reason that they choose it. And it comes really, I guess, in two parts. The first one is, who do our staff members interact with? Who would we like them to be aware that they might have a bias towards a particular group? So is it our customer group? Is it our patients? Is it the public that they have to deal with? What do they typically look like? So are we talking about ethnicity? Are we talking about gender? Are we talking about age? Something that says we need to understand how our staff might be seeing our customer base, the people that they interact with. The second people choose a test is if there are issues in the organisation. So you've had an inclusion survey. The inclusion survey is telling you that you may have an issue around how a particular group are perceived in the organisation, and therefore we choose tests to get underneath those particular issues inside. It could be an employment tribunal, it could be you've had some complaints, it could be a customer has made complaints, but basically something is driving your choice of test. And the third one is, how much time will you have to commit to it? So you can typically allocate 5 minutes per test and 5 minutes to get into the system and complete the practice test. So 2 tests will typically take you 15 minutes. If you feel you can commit the 15 minutes to it, then 2 tests is enough. But for every test you add to the battery, expect another 5 minutes to be added to that. So we've chosen our tests, and we have a number of choices, by the way. I'll take you through some of those choices. Some of them are what I call core tests. So they're tests we've had for a while. So age, so older versus younger. Beards, which is clean shaven versus beardy people. Body weight, slim versus fat. Disability, so people with disabilities versus people without disabilities. Ethnicity, I'll talk about in a little bit of detail because we have a number of versions of the ethnicity test, but typically there are 2 different ethnic groups, and we're looking to see whether people have a preference, a bias for one group over the other. Faith, another one where we have a number of tests, and I'll share some of those with you shortly. Gender, male versus female. Sexual orientation, so we have a gay man test and a lesbian woman test. So those 2 groups are compared with a group of mixed sex couples to look at the preferences. And finally, tattoos, some people with and without tattoos. So just to break those down in a little bit more detail, I've chosen 3 tests where we actually have more than 2 or 3 options on this. The first one is ethnicity. So we have a range of ethnicity tests. There is a white-black test, so white faces with black faces, a white Asian test, a white South Asian test. And when we first launched these tests, those were the 3 tests which were at the core of the work we did. We then got demand for a combined ethnicity test. So people said, we don't want to be sitting 3 tests, it takes too long, can you do us a combined version? And we produced the combined ethnicity test, which includes white faces, but they've also got black, Asian and Southeast Asian faces within that test. And the distributions on the scores look very similar. It's now the best-selling test around ethnicity, by the way, the combined ethnicity test, because it's a very parsimonious way of getting at issues around bias and ethnicity in organisations. We've recently launched a new white-black stop search test, and I'm sure we could produce a white Asian or a white Chinese stop search test if you wanted us to. So there are a number of variations on ethnicity. There are some variations too on gender. So we have a gender value test. Do you see some people as more valuable, talented than others? Gender career. Do you associate men or women with ideas of being at home? So cooking, cleaning, ironing, or ideas of being at work, promotion, progression, career. Gender benevolence is the desire to look after and protect. So do you see one group as in need of protection? Do you see them as weak? Do you see them as not able to do things for themselves? Gender leadership. So do you associate men or women with leadership roles? And we have a number of versions of the leadership test, by the way. So we have a leadership in the higher education sector, in the NHS, and in the police, and we can actually produce leadership versions for virtually any organisation. And we have a women with and without children test. On faith, some relatively new ones here, by the way, but we have specific ones around Islam, Christianity, Sikhism, Hinduism, and the Jewish faith. So a good choice there, in addition to obviously the beards and age and body weight, etc. tests. So a whole range on the platform. So what test might you choose is the question. So one which addresses your need in terms of your customer base, one which addresses your need in terms of your issues that may have occurred, and bear in mind that people probably haven't got limitless time, so you might have to limit it. And typically people will allocate between 2 and 4 tests for staff to take. I have seen organisations who've done up to 10 tests in one batch, but it is actually quite an onerous time demand. It's going to take best part of an hour to do 10 tests. So I would recommend 2, 3 or 4 tests as initial incident. So my next bit of advice to you is in terms of the sample itself, and that's to be quite savvy in the sampling. And the reason I'm saying that is this: in organisations where we're sampling quite large numbers of people, we present an opportunity to actually really get underneath the data. So if you bear with me for a minute, what I'm asking you to do is to ideally look for groups of more than 40, and in a perfect world, more than 100 people. The reason for that is really simple. We can present different results and be more confident of the results extrapolating across the organisation where we have decent sample sizes. So the two which are critical for me are more than 40 and more than 100. That's not to say we can't test smaller groups. So if you have 15 senior leaders, for example, they could be tested separately, or 12 HR managers, but generally speaking, samples of over 40 tend to be more robust. We're looking for an opportunity here, by the way, to use a group in the sample more than once. Let me just explain what that means then. So let's take it that this is our organisation. So we have offices in London, Glasgow, Slough, Birmingham and Oxford, and we have managers, HR staff, operations staff, call centre staff, and consultants working across a number of those offices. And you can see that if we have got 37 managers in London, for example, that's probably not enough to be massively robust. But if we add them all the managers up from across all of the offices, we get a really robust sample of 129. And what we'll do is we'll create a separate link for you. So although you can still tap into, for example, the managers in London or the operations staff in Birmingham, you're also able to combine the samples. And the larger the sample, the more sure we can be that this would actually be more reflective of the wider organisation. So just because we haven't got a lot of people in a job does not mean that we haven't necessarily got a robust sample if we think about how we fragment and stratify that sample as we go. So get the right sample is the next one. And so the second step of it then is simply administering your tests. The good news is we do that. So what we do is we provide you with a link to each of those samples. So if I go back a slide, for example, you might have a link for the HR manager, the HR people in London, a link for the HR people in Glasgow, in Slough. So you could end up in this circumstance with 25 different links. Nothing stopping you to combine the results later on, but it means that you can actually look at the results of each of these groups independently when the data comes back. So a single login and password, but each link is slightly different. So you're still able to identify which of those groups the sample of test results are coming from. And then you can relax, send the link out, people take the test, and then all you need to do is to get your results. So 2 ways of doing that. And the first one is really nothing to do with you. It's the way the staff get their results. So once somebody is tested independently, they get an email to the address that they've chosen, whether it's their work's email address or the opportunity is presented for them to change their email address to one such as their Hotmail account or their partner's account. They get a PDF of their test results along with a booklet called Beating and Baffling Bias. I put my best teeth in for this. And it gives them some tips, it gives them some work they can go through, it gives them some ideas, and it asks them to do some action planning around things that they could do. So they get their results and they get supporting documentation. So that's the staff. You don't need to worry about that. All of the staff who took the test have got those results. What about your results? You want to know, I guess, how do we look as an organisation? What do our results look like? And this is what we do. So we provide you with a link that is peculiar to a particular batch of tests, a particular group, and you can simply hit that link and it downloads to Excel the results from those tests. It strips off the names and email addresses because you don't need to see those for the analysis that you're going to do, because all you're really interested in is what do our HR managers look like? What do our operations staff look like in Glasgow? What about our call centre in Oxford? You can then do whatever analysis you need to do simply from the download link. You're not waiting for somebody to give you the results to do your analysis, or indeed just to check progress so far on the results. So you've got your results downloaded then. What are you going to do with them? So I'm going to give you an example now of a project we ran recently. So an organisation of about 1,000 people, 899 people took the ethnicity test. Other groups took different tests, but every single person in the organisation took an ethnicity test. And this is what we found. So from nearly 900 results, about 23.7% of them had a bias that was strong enough to affect their behaviour. And if we look at the breakdown of that, then what we see is there's some skew in that data, isn't there? So there are some people with bias in favour of black and minority ethnic people, so around about 4%. 3.4% is it, of people have a bias in favour of black people over white people, but the majority, which is 20%, actually have a bias in favour of white over black. And once we get above 100, this is the kind of breakdown that we can do, which is feeling our best. So we can say not only the direction of the bias, but we can tell you how strong that bias is. The other alternative is that we can compare you to other organisations. So in this sample, for example, 23.7%, I've rounded the numbers up to 24%. We can compare that data to local authorities, to the police, to academia, to law firms. We don't have data on all of the tests, by the way. It's only the tests which have actually been sold over the years. But we do actually have that opportunity of comparing ourselves to other organisations. So that's the first level of analysis we can do. The second level then, and this is what happens, by the way, when we start to break those geographical areas down. So between our various offices, in this case, this organisation had 4 offices in different parts of the country. And you can see that it's telling us the percentage of staff in each office across all of the roles. So the operations, the call centre, the HR, in each of those departments which had bias. And you can see in this particular organisation, it's probably suggesting to us, if we look to the Western area, that 32.8% of people in the Western area had a bias around ethnicity strong enough to affect their behaviour. We also see, for example, in the South that we have fairly low levels of disability bias compared to the other parts of the organisation. All of this is really quite useful for us now in terms of making some fairly strategic decisions about where we should be perhaps paying attention, where we need to intervene in this organisation. And the final thing that the analysis gave us was an analysis based upon the particular roles that people held within the organisation. So you remember the data breakdown I gave you. So we have the senior leaders, and in this case, they've taken 3 tests. They've taken the gender career test, the gender leader test, and also obviously the ethnicity test, because everybody took that. And we can get a breakdown of the percentage of staff in the senior leadership team who have a bias. And you can see that probably the gender bias, the gender career bias, 4 out of 10 of the senior leaders in this organization had a gender career bias. Regional managers in this sample then, we can see that there's fairly low levels of bias, in particular around gender, slightly higher levels around ethnicity. The line managers, some really low levels of bias. If you remember, the average sample in this organization was about 23%, and yet amongst their line managers, the ethnicity bias is right the way down at 11.7%. And this organization were quite pleased with those results. As you can imagine, they've still got about 1 in 9 or 1 in 8 people amongst their line managers with an ethnicity bias, but at least they knew where the people were with the lowest levels of bias. They can start to think about how do they use this profiling to be able to drive change in the organization. Operators, you can see about 1 in 3 nearly operators have ethnicity bias. Looks to me like after the senior leadership team, probably those operators are where I will be wanting to pay my attention. A little less in the facilities department, and then relatively low levels or lower levels in the call center. But there's clearly something in the call center around an age bias there because they're highest percentage. So I think you're getting a bit of a feel now for how we can use some of these results. And it all goes back to stratifying the sample, thinking about how we tag the links to the groups so that we can combine and uncombine samples as we go. Finally, cost then. So the cheapest way of administering tests is through an annual licensing package. So basically you buy a minimum of 5,000 tests a year at a price of £1.50 a test. So people take 2 tests, that's £3 per staff member. We will generate with that as many test links as you want, by the way. So in the organisation we've just spoken about, 5 ranks across 5 roles, we're probably talking about 25 links along the way so that they can break their data down. So this is the cheapest way for a single employer to test their staff and continually test their staff. This is probably the best package. You can also buy on a simple per test basis, so 1 credit per test, and they range between £5 for 50 credits each, up to just £3 if you're buying 10,000 credits. But you can see the best value here is that annual license. The only difference being is that the priced credits between £3 and £5 don't have an expiry date, whereas the annual licensing do. You have to use them or lose them by the year end. Other costs involved then, if you want us to do a little bit of charting and the sector comparisons for you, there's a £50 charge for that. If you want us to write that detailed report where we break everything down, we put things into pretty tables for you, we can do that. But obviously, until we know the size of that sample, we wouldn't know how much work would go into that. But we can do a full report right for you if you want us to. If you're not using the annual license, there is a £10 charge per link. So if they've got 25 links, it's going to cost them £250. If they're using the annual license, those links are free. So typically, for example, if you're testing 1,000 staff taking 2 tests, so 2,000 tests at £4.50, because that's the band they fall in, it's going to cost you around about £9,000, plus the £150 for generating perhaps up to 15 links. Or if you took out a 12-month license and had those 20 free links with 8,000 tests loaded up for 4,000 staff, you could get that for £12,000. So you can think the kind of economies of scale of using those licenses. So to finish then, a couple of ideas that I've got which might interest you around how you might use bias testing generally then. So in addition to doing that idea of testing everybody or large numbers of people in an organisation or part of an organisation, there are some other possible uses. So for example, you might decide you're going to give all new recruits to the organisation a couple of tests, give them some feedback on their biases. You might choose in these circumstances, for example, to give them the gender and ethnicity test. You might, for example, test HR department and trainers around ethnicity again, but also around gender career. So if they're, for example, dealing with people with their teaching and training, age might be an issue. The commitments that people might have at home might be an issue. So you might think about those 3 tests for that group. People who are involved in interviews, sifting application forms, you might, for example, decide to give them the disability test and the ethnicity test. Line managers who are managing people in the workplace, you might give them the disability or sexual orientation test. Again, it depends what issues you've had, what your staff profile might look like. You might decide to give all your customers facing staff ethnicity and gender tests. Or if you've got staffs, for example, who are moving between the Oxford office and the Slough office, you might decide that you might give them tests that reflect the local population on the basis of ethnicity, nationality, or faith. So just a few ideas there then along the way. And finally, you might want to adopt something like a 3-month rolling program. So every 3 months on your intranet, you post a link to 3 new tests, perhaps one ethnicity based, one gender based, and another one, so the staff get some feedback on their biases. Even though they might have previously been bias tested, we're keeping the interest for bias testing going. So that's all I've got to say then. That was designed to be quite a short session. And with that, I will say thank you very much for your time. And if you want to know any more, give us a call. Pete Jones, Sharp Professional Chartered Psychologist. The contact details are there. And we look forward to hearing from you.